From Columbia University, the Gray Matters CU podcast is a show about the goings-on of neuroscience professors on campus and the motivations and explanations behind their research. I'm Rochelle Vaintroop, co-editor-in-chief of Gray Matters CU, and on the show today, Lila Baer talks with Dr. Sue Mendelsohn about our brain's most intensive task, writing. So, can you start just by giving us a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. My name is Sue Mendelsohn, and I'm the Associate Director of the Undergraduate Writing Program here at Columbia and also the Director of the Writing Center.
Great. Okay. So I honestly have a ton of questions for you, but the reason why your name came up was because someone in the Gray Matters Journal brought up that he had taken your course about how writers think. So I was wondering if you could just tell me how and why you decided to create that course.
I made that course for one practical reason and then an impractical reason. The practical reason was the Writing Center this was a couple of years ago, was going to start hiring undergraduates to be undergraduate peer writing fellows. And I wanted a place where people who wanted to apply for those jobs could come and really prepare and get great at the research in the field before applying for the job. The not so practical reason is because the research on how people learn how to write is fascinating and counterintuitive. And I thought it would be really, really fun to share some of that research with undergraduates here at Columbia.
I know that you made a whole course on it, but can you share maybe some of the key points or the coolest points about the research that you encountered when making your course?
Sure. I'll share the sort of cognitive psychology part of it. The cognitive psychology part of it is that the link between writing and memory is profound. And it's profound in ways that have deep implications for how we approach writing and what differentiates people who approach writing successfully and people who spend just as much, if not more, time and energy on it and are not successful. The linchpin factor is how we use our memory.
So if I write down my notes that I took in class versus my friend who spent an hour just rereading them, I'm probably going to remember them more. And we see that, right? Is that what you're trying to say?
Right. And so there's some great things that we can do, like writing down your notes and then reading them later.
Right.
So you're engaging in a kind of deep learning through writing and then locking that idea into your short or your long-term memory when you return to it later. And so cognitive psychologists look at why is it that something that you write down you're more likely to learn or keep with you than something that you just listen to. There's a cognitive psychologist named Ronald Kellogg, who's at St. Louis University here in the United States, who's asked this very question with a team of French researchers who he works with. And so one of the studies that they did is they looked at a bunch of different people doing certain kinds of learning activities, including a bunch of different writing activities, like note-taking, also like drafting something, like revising something. And they compared those kind of learning activities or cognitive activities to things like just listening, like we were talking about, or just looking at something. And what they found is that people who were writing were spending far more cognitive effort to do that than people who were learning in non-writing kinds of ways. In fact, they were spending slightly more cognitive effort to do any kind of writing activity than a chess master would spend playing chess. And so the comparison between chess and writing is really apt. And when you look at cognitive psychology, they're constantly comparing the two. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because chess is fascinating for researchers because you have to make so many choices when you play chess. There's trillions or quadrillions or whatever of possible chess games, of possible moves. And so it's a feat of the memory to see, to imagine all the possible upcoming moves that you could make for several moves and your opponent's moves and take all of those into account. And so chess masters have certain strategies they use not only to enhance their memories, but also to lessen demands on their memories when they don't need to use them. So they're trying to use their memories in really efficient ways. And what cognitive psychologists find is that expert writers are similar. So less experienced writers use their memories in really inefficient ways when they approach writing. More effective, like professional writers, use their memories in more efficient ways. The twist is the ways that are the most sort of efficient in using our memories actually look the messiest and most chaotic on the page. So there's this strange kind of thing that happens when we think about what counts as efficient writing. It's sort of the opposite of what you would think.
So as a writer yourself, how have you been able to apply this?
Oh, I like that question. I spend a lot more time than I used to at the sort of exploratory stages of writing. And so I try to make most of my writing that more exploratory writing, where I'm explicitly choosing not to polish my writing. Note-taking, I'm a big bullet pointer. And so I'll do lots of bullet pointing. All kinds of ways to announce to myself, like, hey, I'm not finalizing this. I'm not writing it in stone. Because I'm trying to separate out the act of using writing to think from the act of using writing to convey or communicate some sort of thought or feeling.
Can you differentiate between those two modes of writing?
Yeah. So there's a writing researcher who studies cognition named Linda Flower, and she makes a distinction between what she calls writer-based prose and reader-based prose. And she says writer-based prose is the prose that we compose almost in our heads, that we write for ourselves. Those are our internal thoughts that we're expressing to ourselves to figure out what we think. And so in my early stages of writing, I'm really just exploring my ideas through writer-based prose. I don't care if they make sense to you. I care that they make sense to me. And by doing that, I'm lessening demands in my memory because I'm not also thinking about you and what you need. I'm just writing it down in my own idiom.
Right.
And then later, once I really dedicated my cognitive effort to fully exploring what I think and how I want to structure my own thinking, then I can turn and say, okay, how do you make sense of this? How can I compose this in a structure in a way that makes sense to you? So there I'm making the shift from writer to reader-based prose. And by separating out those two separate ways of thinking about my writing, I'm lessening demands on my memory at each stage because I'm not trying to do too much.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. The way I'm thinking of it is kind of like the journal phase.
I like that way of thinking about it.
You're kind of like saying, don't multitask.
That is kind of what I'm saying. Yeah. I'll share with you also, Lila, some other things I do in my own writing process. And I'd love to talk to you about also how it relates to writer's block and cognition, because there are a lot of links here. And there's so many things that people can do to fight writer's block that we've studied that are great. So one other thing I have learned to do in my writing process is let go of the idea that my first sentence in the draft or ideas that I'm exploring on the page need to be the first sentence of the piece I'm actually going to be sending to someone. So in other words, I write out of sequence. Instead of writing from the first sentence to the last or top to bottom of my text, I'm writing from whatever feels easiest toward whatever feels harder. Because if I affirm that writing is the most powerful way that I think, if I can start with my easiest, most accessible thoughts, through writing them down, I learn more and more about what I want to say. When researchers look at writers who instead write in sequence, and they start with, okay, I'm going to write my introduction first. My first sentence that I'm going to write down is going to be the first sentence of my introduction. Obviously, as writers, we probably need to know the most about our project in the introduction because we're sort of setting it up. And so people who write in sequence are starting with the hardest task of their whole project. And so those writers tend to get writer's block. And they tend to procrastinate because they're starting with the hardest thing. What I'm doing is starting with the easiest thing. And through doing the easiest thing, I learn more and more about my project. So by the time I get to my hardest thing, I know so much more about it. And it's not so hard. So I don't really struggle with writer's block.
That's so interesting.
I don't particularly enjoy writing.
Oh.
Probably like most people. I think there are certain unicorns who like writing. I think they're weird.
Well, that's writing interesting to me. Can you elaborate more on the fact that you don't really like writing? Like, what aspect of it do you like?
I love researching.
Okay.
I love discovering new things. Okay. And then when it comes to finding the story or narrative around those things and conveying them to other people, that's really, really, really hard work.
Right.
And so I don't particularly enjoy hard work because I like to just hang out, probably like most of us. But I like having written, and I like the process more as I get through my career, but mostly what I like is research.
Right.
Can I ask, what is that for you? Like, do you enjoy writing, or is it something you have to do?
So I think that surprised me. I really like writing, and I never put a finger on this until just now, but there are two ways that writing can be fun. The first is the more journal entry type of way that I was telling you. That's how I defined it in my head. So I like it because that's just for me, and it helps me figure out what I'm thinking about. I think when I'm assigned to write something and I'm not inspired, that can be really difficult. But if once I get started, then I really like it. But also on another note, I find that I'm able to articulate myself way better when I write.
Writing is the most intensive way to think, right? Because if you think about the metaphor of chess, the reason why cognitive psychologists are so interested in chess is because it presents so many choices. So it's a complex but also measurable activity. So it's great for cognitive psychologists to study.
Right.
But the thing that we're always comparing to chess is writing. It's harder to study, but similar in the sense that it presents quadrillions upon quadrillions of choices. In fact, writing, because language and syntax present us with so many choices, writing is far, far more complicated than chess. It's just the closest thing we can compare it to. And so long-term memory is this sort of big storage space where there's all these sort of networks of ideas that are bound up together. And when those ideas sort of have strong pathways into our working memory, we can quickly use that executive function, that sort of traffic cop of the brain, to connect what's in our long-term memory, put that in our short-term working memory so that we can work with it. But you can imagine if you were a writer who was, figuring out correct punctuation and grammar, along with what's the right word I have here that my reader wants, along with how do I represent this research, what is the source saying, and the structure of your own ideas, and all of these things all at once, really multitasking.
Right.
That traffic cop, there's a bottleneck at that intersection, and your brain has real trouble figuring out what's the most useful information to get into your short-term memory. They do studies where they'll give writers a task that's a really unfamiliar task to do. Like they'll ask them to write in a new genre they've never written about, or they'll ask them to write in a new domain, in other words, a new subject area that's not familiar to them. And in each of those situations, writers who otherwise in their field produce high quality, intellectually complex writing are actually, when they're asked to analyze something, only able to summarize. These are writers who know how to analyze, and when they're given something familiar, they do a great job. But when given an unfamiliar genre or subject, it looks like they're not as sharp on the page. And it's because they're trying to do too many new things at once. It gums up their short-term memory. And their thinking is simpler on the page. And it's because they haven't been able to manage their memory. Basically, when we are presented with really new languages, subjects, or writing genres, our cognitive ability to do higher level intellectual operations on the page drops. And really all we can end up doing is summarizing or saying back to someone what a text is about, for example. The reason why is because we don't have fluid paths for pulling things in our long-term memory down into our short-term working memory, which is where we need that information to be able to make decisions about how to write. We've just put our short-term working memory is a very constrained small space, unlike our long-term memory.
Right.
And so if we have too much in there, we get overloaded and we just step back to the next simplest thing we know how to do and we feel comfortable with. So there's two researchers, Mary Jo Reef and Amis Bawarshi, and they have this idea that helps us understand or distinguish between the writers who are able to do what we call transfer, what they know how to do really well, to a project that's less familiar to them, versus writers who struggle to transfer what they know how to do really well to a new project and therefore just hold tight to just the thing they know to do well, even though it's not appropriate in the new situation. So Reef and Bawarshi call these two groups boundary crossers and boundary guarders. And the boundary crossers are the people who are able to sort of use metacognition to name what they learned by doing certain kinds of projects that they got good at, and to name the moves or strategies that they learned from them, and be able to abstract which are appropriate to carry to a new situation.
Well, were they able to identify what differentiated these people?
There are lots of researchers working on that question. Among them, Kathy Yancey, Driscoll and Wells, and others. And here's some of the things that those researchers have found. One of the things that they look at is what's called dispositions. These are certain assumptions or attitudes about learning. One of those dispositions is something a little bit counterintuitive, which is the disposition of a novice. So I think oftentimes when we're like heading into a new rhetorical situation that we're writing in, we imagine that we really have to present as though we are the most polished expert. We have that imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
So that nobody will notice we don't know what we're doing. And in fact, students or any writers who approach a new situation as a learner and are pretty transparent about that often have a disposition that then enables them to learn.
I mean, I'm just wondering how strongly linked you think writing is to intelligence, or whether you think it's just ability to learn.
I think it's the latter. And for writing in particular, what the cognitive psychology research tells us is it's the ability to manage your memory. Isn't that odd?
That's so crazy.
And so many writers think, I just have to work harder. I just have to push through. I just have to focus more.
Right.
And the good news is that's not really it. You're probably already working really hard,
right,
especially if you're a Columbia student. And so what you can do is just work more strategically to lessen demands on your memory,
right,
by, for example, doing the thing we talked about a few minutes ago, doing one thing at a time,
right,
rather than trying to figure out everything. Writing from easiest to hardest rather than top to bottom.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of strategies you can use. And so managing your memory more effectively actually will help you develop as a writer.
Right.
They do studies with elementary school students where they test the students' reading skills. They have them all write essays, and then they assess them. And then separately, they test the students' memory. And the results match up. The students who have great memory capacity are also the students who are stronger writers.
Whoa. No, that really is a mind blow. Because I'm just thinking about it. One theme that has come up in neuroscience and in like so much that I've learned is just the ability to kind of like train your brain, and just the lack of importance in like natural ability, and more so in your ability to learn. And memory, obviously, I don't think most people directly correlate like memory to intelligence.
For me, that research is really exciting because it underscores exactly what you were just saying, that writing is a learned skill.
Yeah.
And that we can learn it by doing certain strategic things. So for example, so many writers who experience writer's block, they think it's a character issue. Like, I just have to try harder. I just have to be more disciplined. And they end up feeling terrible about themselves and terrible about writing.
Right.
And the good news that so much cognitive psychology research suggests to us about things like writer's block is that you don't just pushing through or trying harder isn't the solution. The solution is actually just adopting different practices that lower demands on your memory. Everyone can do that. Everyone can become a better writer and someone who enjoys writing more, or at least makes the task a little less difficult. I think it's really heartening and surprising.
I would agree with that. I also think that sounds heartening. I like that word.
It makes me wonder whether, I think I'm just saying the thing that you're saying too, like, is writing a product of intelligence or a producer of intelligence?
Right. And I think because also some people are more naturally inclined to write, or they feel more comfortable, or they're just better. Yeah, some people are better at it initially, like without putting the work in.
I wonder how much of that is natural versus people who've been encouraged or
read,
rewarded or discouraged.
Right. That actually is a good point, because I think that a lot of people who are strong writers probably also read a lot in their childhood.
Reading is a huge factor, right?
Right. It's crazy. When you read a book, then my vocabulary just expands.
But the other thing you're doing when you read, this goes back to the neuroscience, so there's this thing called chunking that neuroscientists talk about and study, right? And it's the idea that one of the things that distinguishes experts from non-experts in a particular activity is that when experts are faced with the complexity of their activity, whether it's, playing the cello or playing chess, what they do is they're able to sort of group lots of ideas together in a chunk. And so it sounds like a very unexpert term, but that's the term neuroscientists use.
Yeah.
So they will chunk. So for example, if I'm a chess master, instead of just seeing all the individual moves on the board, which is what I actually see because I'm not a chess master, I might have, 20 different common offenses and defenses in my mind.
Right.
And I can start to see patterns of moves and identify them as one of those, defenses or something like that, or one of those strategies.
Right.
And the same thing happens with writing. So for example, I might have in my mind, for an academic research article, probably, these days, the 5 most popular ways that people sort of start an opener or something like that. Now, you're talking about reading, and the more that you read, sort of the better that translates into your writing skill. That's because you're starting to develop a range of possibilities of what writing can do, and then chunking those as strategies together that you can then take with you.
Yeah, that sounds super efficient.
Yeah.
And it also takes...
Because you're lessening demands on your memory, rather than seeing every opener you've read as a separate entity that's this unique thing.
Right.
You're grouping them into certain strategies or approaches, and then you just have to remember 5 things instead of 1,000.
Right. And it's also kind of just like the way you learn a language, you stop translating every single word. You just hear a sentence, and then maybe there's one word you have to individually translate.
Yeah, you start to hear things in chunks.
Yeah. Okay, I have a few wrap-up questions, and they're super quick.
Okay.
So these are just rapid-fire questions for you.
Okay.
So books or podcasts?
I listen to such trash podcasts. Right now, I'll give the not total trash one I'm listening to. Right now, I'm listening to 30 for 30, which is a sort of long-form sports podcast.
Okay.
And books. Right now, I'm reading The Outlaw Ocean.
Yeah.
Which is a series of essays about crazy stuff that happens at sea. It's fantastic.
Okay, one more question.
Okay, bring it.
I'm just trying to pick the best one. If you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Whatever superpower it is that would give everyone food and housing. It's like the Elon Musk but not a jackass superpower of just giving the money and fixing everything systemically.
Yeah, I hope Elon Musk hears this. And he's like,
yeah,
he'll finally, it'll finally click. Okay, and then my final question for you is just, what advice do you have for students who are going forth in their career and don't really know what to aim for?
I would say talk to somebody. The savviest students I know through the Writing Center and my colleagues here are first generation college students who have really learned the skill of showing up in someone's office and saying, well, I've done this. What's next? What would you recommend? Or I'm not yet figuring out this thing. Or how do people usually handle these kinds of situations or these kinds of projects? People who ask what feel like the obvious question that's not obvious at all, I think learn the most. I really admire those people.
Yeah, that was really good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, so let go of the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, true. Okay, well, anyway, thank you so much for speaking with me. And I don't know, maybe I'll swing by the Writing Center sometime.
That would be great.
Thanks,
you.
Thanks,
It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. Thanks for listening to the show this week. If you want to request a neuroscience professor to hear from, you can do so at our website, graymattersjournalcu.org. If you want to follow the show on social media, our Instagram is @graymatterscu. This episode was produced and edited by Lila Bear. Research was done by Melody Fang and Anna Sofia Rico Rozo. Our production staff also includes Sam Hutchinson, Mariana Mosen, and Chloe Wong. Our executive producer is Lila Bear. I'm Rochelle Vaintrub, and you've been listening to Gray Matters CU podcast.